In the heart of the Western Plains, a woman's long solitude is tested by 7 relentless riders, a fragile map, and her instincts honed over years. Experience suspense, strategy, and survival in a cinematic Western tale that will grip you till the final moment. Subscribe and like for more adventures. She lived with a map she could not read, a fragile relic of inked lines and faded symbols, one that had survived fires, storms, and decades of neglect, yet still whispered promises she could not decipher. Every night she unrolled it across the rough-hewn boards of her cabin table, tracing the curves and angles with fingertips that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of curiosity and a lifetime of unanswered questions. The paper was brittle and cracked along the edges, the marks of time etched into every crease, yet she treated it with reverence, as though the map were a silent oracle, waiting to reveal the truth that had eluded her for years. She had been told once by a wandering trader who left as quickly as he appeared that the map led to a place of unimaginable value, or perhaps unspeakable danger, that only those patient enough to study it might ever understand. She had spent countless hours squinting under flickering lantern light, trying to match its lines to the horizon outside her cabin, the sparse vegetation, and the distant ridges that blurred at sunset. Nothing made sense, yet every feature of the map seemed connected to something she could feel but not see, as though it pulsed with hidden intent. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, bringing with it the scent of dust, sage, and the distant snow on the hills, a reminder that the world was vast, untamed, and indifferent to the struggles of a single woman. She had grown accustomed to solitude, to the quiet rhythm of her days and the soft, haunting cries of coyotes at night, but the map filled her with restless anticipation, a subtle gnawing at the edges of her mind that told her time was moving toward something inevitable. Some nights she dreamed of shadows moving across the plains, figures she could not name, their presence lingering like a threat she could not escape. She had learned to trust her instincts, her senses honed by years of survival, yet the map's mystery unsettled even her, demanding vigilance she had not felt in years. She did not know if it was destiny, luck, or some cruel design that drew her attention to the map night after night, but she felt its pull, a magnetic insistence that refused to let her forget. Each curl of paper and faded mark seemed to contain a fragment of a story, fragments that teased her imagination, suggesting a past she had not lived and a future she could not yet grasp. She kept it close, guarding it as fiercely as any weapon, knowing that when the right people came seeking it, or her, the map could determine survival, allegiance, or death. And though she could not read the lines or understand the symbols, she knew with a certainty that was both frightening and liberating that the moment of reckoning was approaching. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the plains, beyond the wind-whipped ridges, the 7 Comanche she had never met, but somehow knew, were already moving, guided by forces she could not perceive, but would soon feel in the very bones of the land she called home. By midday, the sun had climbed high, casting stark light across the undulating plains, turning every ridge and hollow into sharp contrasts of shadow and brilliance. She crouched behind a jagged outcrop, the map carefully tucked into her coat, feeling the warmth of the sun only lightly against her tense muscles. Each hoofbeat of the Comanche riders reverberated in her chest like a drum. Each gust of wind seemed to carry their intentions, and every movement of their horses suggested a choreography honed by survival and discipline. She had spent years learning to read the land in ways that others overlooked, the subtle shifts of grass indicating animal trails, the way dust curls in the wind to reveal hidden hollows, the patterns of stone formations that could mask a sudden approach. And now, all of that skill, all of that patient observation, was being tested in real time. The riders advanced deliberately, maintaining a loose formation that suggested both respect for one another and a tacit understanding of the stakes at hand. She could see the glint of sunlight on their weapons, the way they communicated silently. Through nods, glances, and subtle shifts in posture, a language as clear and precise as any she had learned from maps or letters. Her fingers brushed the edge of the map through her coat, a reassuring tactile connection to the mystery that had defined her life, a reminder that no matter how carefully she studied the terrain, some truths were beyond comprehension until confronted. Every instinct told her that this encounter would not simply be a passage of observation, that something pivotal, irreversible, and possibly dangerous was about to unfold. She drew in a slow breath, letting the dry air fill her lungs, and adjusted her stance, balancing readiness with subtle patience. Her mind cataloged every possibility: confrontation, negotiation, misdirection, and the potential for alliance or betrayal. The land itself seemed to bend to her focus. Shadows lengthened, wind shifted, and the distant cliffs framed the approaching figures with a quiet inevitability. She could sense, more than see, the intent of the Comanche riders. They were not aimless, they carried purpose in every motion, a history she could not yet read, but one she felt vibrating through the plains like an unseen pulse. She pressed herself closer to the rocks, aware that when she revealed herself, there would be no turning back, no room for hesitation, only the unfolding of what the map had quietly promised all these years, that the moment of reckoning was imminent, and that the fate of her solitude would be challenged by forces as old and unyielding as the land itself. As the late afternoon sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and burnt gold, she carefully navigated the narrow ridge that overlooked the valley below, the map snug against her chest, its crinkled edges pressing lightly into her ribs like a protective charm. Each step was measured, deliberate, her boots crunching softly against loose stones, the sound masked by the distant echo of hooves on hard-packed earth. The Comanche riders moved methodically, keeping formation and scanning the terrain as if the land itself were a living document, recording each moment of approach. She observed the way their horses shifted their weight, how reins were tightened and loosened with subtle precision, the glint of weapons catching the dwindling sunlight, and the faint rustle of the wind carrying the faint scent of leather, smoke, and dry grass. Her fingers brushed the map, feeling its fragile texture beneath the layers of cloth, and she recalled all the stories she had been told about this land, stories of old alliances, of conflicts that had scarred both people and plains, of paths that led nowhere and yet promised everything. Time seemed to stretch, elongated by anticipation, as each rider became more than a figure in the distance. They were a question, a challenge, a reflection of the unknown she had lived alongside for years. She paused at a rocky outcrop, allowing herself a moment to catch her breath, to center herself against the cold edge of reality pressing in from all sides. The wind carried a faint hiss across the ridge, mingling with the distant cry of a hawk, circling overhead, signaling that decisions were imminent. She understood that the map, while unreadable in language, was alive in purpose, guiding her not through literal directions, but through intuition and patience. The Comanche riders were not merely approaching, they were converging, each motion a deliberate choice toward an outcome she could not yet predict. And yet, as her eyes met the undulating forms of dust in motion below, she felt a strange calm settle over her, a sense that the reckoning would not come suddenly, but as a series of intricate movements, each step and turn dictated as much by understanding of the land as by human will. She gripped the map tighter, the leather fraying at the edges, and allowed herself a single thought, quiet but fierce. No matter what they sought, no matter how precise their pursuit, she would meet it on her own terms, guided by the silent lines that had defined her life in shadow and dust. The golden hours stretched across the plains, casting long, jagged shadows that twisted along the undulating earth, and she remained crouched behind a small hilltop, the worn map pressing against her chest as if it could somehow shield her from the inevitability descending from the valley below. Each moment felt heavier, charged with the tension of unseen consequences and whispered threats carried on the wind. the kind that made her heart hammer in measured, deliberate beats. She studied the Comanche riders with an almost clinical precision, noting the subtle sway of their mounts, the calculated angle of their bodies leaning against the wind, the way their hands hovered near weapons with a familiarity born of countless confrontations. Time seemed to elongate, each second a grain of sand in an hourglass suspended above the dry earth, and she allowed herself to think not of fear but of strategy, recalling every ridge, every crevice, every hidden path she had memorized over years of solitary wandering. The map, unreadable though it was, throbbed like a living artifact against her chest, its brittle edges almost pulsating with some hidden energy, guiding her instincts as if the paper itself understood the land better than any eye could. She adjusted her stance, keeping her movements minimal, aware that any abrupt motion could betray her presence, yet knowing she must remain vigilant, ready for action at the precise moment. Dust swirled in miniature cyclones across the valley, caught in the wake of the horses' hooves, and in that hazy veil, she discerned their intent, the silent language of movement that spoke louder than words ever could. There was a rhythm to the approach, a cadence that spoke of inevitability, but she refused to surrender to it, threading patience with preparation, letting her mind trace every potential outcome and every response that might allow her to dictate the unfolding of events. She felt the air shift, the wind carrying scents of leather, horse, and dry grass that spoke of history, of blood, and of stories waiting to be completed. In her solitude, she had grown adept at listening to these subtle cues, reading the land as one might read a book, understanding the unspoken narratives embedded in every hollow and rise. And as the sun sank closer to the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of blood orange and violet, she steadied her breathing, pressing herself closer to the hilltop's edge, knowing that when the first rider crested the distant ridge, everything she had prepared, every instinct honed in solitude, would be tested against the precision and purpose of the Comanche who were coming not merely for the map, but for the reckoning it promised. The sun sank lower, igniting the sky with fiery streaks of orange and crimson that reflected off the plains like molten gold, and she remained crouched on the ridge, the brittle map pressed to her chest, each crease and faded symbol a silent companion in the moment of imminent confrontation. Every breath she drew was measured, the dry wind biting at her face and carrying the scent of horses, dust, and leather from below, a sensory tapestry that painted the movements of the riders in sharp relief. She studied them with unwavering focus, noting how the Comanche maintained an almost imperceptible spacing between mounts, their heads scanning the horizon, hands brushing subtly against reins and weapons, communicating in silence with gestures and subtle shifts that spoke of coordination honed over years of survival and pursuit. She traced the contours of the valley with her eyes, recognizing every hollow where she could hide, every slope that could give her leverage, every ridge that could mask her presence, each one a potential ally in the game of life and death that now played out in real time before her. The map, fragile though it was, seemed to pulse in her hands, as though its faded lines carried knowledge her mind had yet to decode, but her instincts already understood. A rhythm of survival embedded in ink and fiber that connected her to the land itself. She adjusted her posture, careful not to disturb the small stones under her boots, feeling the pulse of the plains beneath her, aware that any sudden movement could reveal her position and alter the balance of power. Dust swirled from the riders' hooves in the valley below, catching the last rays of sunlight and forming ghostly veils that both concealed and revealed the intentions of those advancing. She considered each possible scenario, every path and counter-move, calculating with precision honed from years of solitary observation, her mind a battlefield of anticipation and strategy. There was no room for error. Every decision would echo, determining whether she maintained control, fell prey to circumstance, or perhaps discovered the meaning of the map she had carried for so long. The ridge beneath her seemed to hum with Latent energy, the land itself aware of the unfolding confrontation, as if the spirits of the plains whispered warnings and guidance alike. The Comanche riders were patient but inexorable, each movement deliberate, each breath a prelude to the inevitable, yet she felt no fear, only a cold, fierce clarity. She had been alone for too long to be caught unprepared, and as the sun slipped behind distant mesas, bathing the plains in shadow and gold, she braced herself for the moment when the first rider would crest the ridge and the map's silent story would begin to reveal its consequences. The next morning broke with a brittle clarity, the kind that made every sound on the frozen plains sharper, every shadow heavier, and every gust of wind a reminder that time was slipping toward the inevitable. She wrapped the map in a cloth, careful to preserve the fragile edges, and stepped into the chill, letting the first light of dawn illuminate the contours of the land she had memorized, yet never fully understood. Her eyes scanned the distant ridges, noting every rise and dip, every twisted tree and crumbling rock outcrop, committing each to memory as though it might save her life in the hours to come. She could feel the pulse of the plains beneath her. Boots, a quiet rhythm that had become a constant companion through years of solitude. In the distance, 7 figures moved along the horizon, faint but distinct, their silhouettes riding in careful formation across the pale grasses. She did not flinch, though a subtle tremor ran through her fingers. Experience had taught her that fear could be a tool as much as a danger, that knowing when to wait and when to act could tip the balance between survival and death. She tucked the map into her coat, the lines pressing against her chest, almost as if they had a heartbeat of their own, sinking to her own. The Comanche riders advanced methodically, their horses' hooves whispering against the frost-covered ground, the early light glinting off their weapons and the edges of their cloaks. She understood instinctively that they were not mindless marauders. They were purposeful, precise, and patient, each motion a testament to training, discipline, and intent. Her breath formed clouds in the cold air as she considered every possible scenario: attack, negotiation, deception. But the truth was that she had learned long ago that the land itself could be an ally or a trap. Each ridge, each creek, each hollow could conceal advantage or peril, and she had spent countless hours memorizing these subtleties, knowing they would be decisive when the moment arrived. She adjusted the strap of her pack, feeling the weight of the map settle against her shoulder like a talisman. There was no room for hesitation. Every decision from here on out would be magnified by consequence. She took one slow, deliberate step forward, feeling the frost bite at her boots, and scanned the horizon once more, noting the subtle signs that distinguished friend from foe, threat from curiosity. Time stretched, elongated by anticipation and the harsh rhythm of her heartbeat. As the Comanche drew nearer, each rider a shadow of inevitability, each movement a silent question. Would she endure? Would she deceive? Or would she finally unravel the mystery that had haunted her for so long? The wind carried whispers across the plains, as though the land itself conspired to reveal the truth. Rustling dry grasses, nudging loose stones, and beckoning her toward a destiny she had only ever glimpsed in dreams, and the faded lines of a map she could not read. Twilight descended across the plains, draping the ridges and hollows in deep purples and cold blues, and she crouched behind jagged rocks, her pulse steady, the brittle map pressed firmly against her chest as though its fragile paper could shield her from the inevitability approaching. Every sense was heightened, each sound amplified: the distant shuffle of hooves over dry grass, the faint swish of reins, even the subtle creak of saddles as the riders maintained their careful formation. Her eyes traced the contours of the land, memorized over countless solitary days, noting shadows that lengthened unnaturally with the fading light, hidden hollows that could conceal her movement, and every rise that might offer a vantage point or a trap. The Comanche advanced with measured patience, a silent rhythm dictating their approach. communicating in ways she could only perceive through instinct. Shifts of weight, brief gestures, and subtle eye contact, each one a word in an unspoken dialogue of strategy and intent. She felt the wind tug at her coat and her hair, carrying dust and the faint aroma of leather and smoke, and she focused, letting the environment speak to her, guiding her intuition as surely as any map could. Each crevice and ridge was familiar, yet the presence of the riders transformed the plains into a living chessboard, with each stone and shadow a potential advantage or threat, demanding careful thought and swift, precise action. She pressed herself lower, the map trembling slightly under the tension, and considered every possible scenario: confrontation, evasion, misdirection, or perhaps an unlikely alliance. The approaching figures were relentless, their rhythm in harmony. With the land, a silent prelude to the moment when patience would be tested against audacity, caution against courage, and solitude against inevitability. The sky darkened further, the last remnants of sunlight glinting off the horses' coats and weapons, casting fleeting golden streaks across the landscape that seemed to highlight the tension thickening with each heartbeat. She had lived decades in quiet observation, but the arrival of these 7 Comanche riders transformed her lurid solitude into a charged living narrative, one where every instinct, every memory, and every line of the unreadable map could become the difference between survival and surrender. Shadows deepened, dust drifted lazily in the cooling air, and the silent promise of confrontation drew closer with each measured step the riders took across the plains, leaving her perched, ready, and waiting for the inevitable moment that would define her fate. Nightfall arrived with a sudden clarity, the sky transforming into a deep indigo canvas spattered with early stars, and she remained crouched behind the low rocks, the fragile map secured against her chest as a silent companion in the tense darkness. Every sound seemed magnified in the cool night air: the distant snort of horses, the soft brush of reins against leather, the subtle creak of saddles shifting weight. She could feel the pulse of the land beneath her, the small vibrations carried through earth and stone, signaling the measured approach of the 7 riders below. Shadows deepened across the valley, stretching along the contours of the plains, and the riders' figures merged and separated with the undulating terrain, their movements precise, deliberate, and imbued with a silent understanding that only experience could forge. She shifted slightly, careful not to dislodge the stones beneath her boots, the map pressing faintly against her heart as if resonating with her anticipation. Every ridge and hollow was now more than just familiar geography. It had become a participant in this silent confrontation, offering concealment, vantage, or peril at the merest suggestion of motion. The Comanche advanced with deliberate patience, their coordination a reflection of countless shared campaigns, the soft rhythm of their horses' hooves, an unspoken code she could sense rather than see. Her mind traced possibilities and contingencies, each step of the approaching riders considered against her knowledge of the terrain, her instinctive reading of timing, and her unspoken understanding of human behavior under pressure. The wind whispered across the plains, teasing loose dust and dry grasses, carrying scents of leather, sweat, and smoke from distant campfires, and she inhaled slowly, grounding herself in these sensory cues that offered both warning and guidance. Her eyes scanned the horizon continually, catching the subtle movement of dust spiraling from each hoof, the fleeting glint of metal, and the measured sway of riders who seemed to anticipate her every calculation. The map, though indecipherable in print, served as a psychological anchor, a constant reminder that every ridge, every shadow, and every hollow had meaning, a language she now read fluently through intuition and experience. The cold of the night began to seep into her bones, yet her resolve remained unshaken, each breath slow and deliberate, her muscles coiled for action, her mind acutely aware that in this vast expanse of dust, shadow, and starlight, every decision, however small, could determine the outcome of the coming confrontation. And so she waited, tense but patient, the unseen narrative of the map converging with the inevitability of the 7 Comanche riders' approach, each silent motion bringing her closer to the resolution she had long anticipated, yet could never have fully imagined. The first light of pre-dawn filtered weakly across the plains, bathing ridges and hollows in muted gold and pale violet, and she remained crouched on the rocky ridge, the brittle map pressed tightly against her chest as if it could somehow transmit guidance through its fragile fibers. The world felt suspended in a quiet tension, every rustle of grass and shift of stone magnified in the stillness, each subtle vibration in the earth beneath her boots a signal that the riders were drawing nearer with deliberate, unwavering intent. The 7 Comanche advanced with precise discipline, their silhouettes carved sharply against the valley floor, each motion a carefully measured negotiation with the terrain. Dust rose in thin columns from the horses' hooves, caught in the pale light, blending with the lingering mist to create a shifting veil that both revealed and obscured their movements. Her eyes followed each figure meticulously, noting the subtle signals passed silently among them. A tilt of the head, a pause in step, the slight flex of a wrist, the shifting balance of a horse, all tiny cues revealing patterns, intentions, and readiness. She felt the map, fragile and worn, pressing against her side, a tactile reminder that the land itself was a living document, with knowledge embedded in every ridge, hollow, and path that no words could fully capture. Each moment became a study of patience and observation. The line between waiting and acting blurred as her instincts and experience guided her awareness. The cold pre-dawn wind whispered across the plains, tugging at her coat and stirring the dust around the riders, carrying with it faint scents of leather, horse, and earth, subtle but telling markers of presence and motion. Every ridge, every shadow, every contour became critical in the unspoken dialogue unfolding between her and the approaching Comanche, a silent test of perception, timing, and resolve. As the horizon began to brighten in delicate strokes of rose and silver, she adjusted her stance, muscles coiled, senses alert, fully immersed in the interplay between the landscape and the moving figures below. She understood that the moment of revelation was near, that the map's true purpose, indecipherable for so long, was about to manifest not through ink and paper, but through action and consequence, and that her solitary understanding of the land and of human movement would determine whether she could meet the inevitability arriving from the valley on her own terms or be swept into a story already written in the dust of the plains. Sunrise finally broke over the plains, spilling a harsh golden light across ridges and valleys, illuminating the swirling dust kicked up by the 7 Comanche riders advancing with relentless precision. She stood on the ridge, the fragile map clutched tightly to her chest, feeling the weight of years spent alone and countless hours deciphering the land through instinct and observation converge in this single, decisive moment. Every breath she drew was steady, controlled, a deliberate counterpoint to the tension that radiated from the valley below. The riders' movements were synchronized, the subtle communication between them, a tilt of a head, a shift in posture, the soft tapping of hooves speaking a language she could sense even if she could not read it. The wind carried the scent of leather, horse, and earth, mingling with the metallic tang of early sunlight glinting off weapons, and the air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. She surveyed the terrain one last time, her eyes catching every hollow, every rise, every crevice where she could move or hide, while simultaneously planning how she might dictate the encounter, how she might assert control over the outcome that the riders sought to determine. The map, fragile and worn, seemed almost to hum with unspoken knowledge, its lines and symbols no longer meaningless, connecting her past solitude to the present confrontation. Dust swirled around the riders, creating transient barriers of opacity, and light, masking their approach yet revealing their intent, their patience and focus, a reflection of the deadly seriousness of their mission. She understood that the moment of contact was imminent, that every instinct, every movement, every decision in the next few seconds would be pivotal. She adjusted her stance, gripping the map tighter, heart steady, eyes sharp, ready to engage. Not just with the riders, but with the truth the map had always represented. And as the first rider crested a distant ridge, the sun glinting off the leather and steel of his gear, she felt the culmination of her long journey, the convergence of her knowledge, patience, and resilience, and a profound clarity washed over her. The map had always been a guide not to a place, but to herself.